Okay, hi everyone, I'm Alyssa from Action on Disability within Ethnic Communities, or ADEC for short. And ADEC is a not-for-profit organisation which assists people from non-English speaking backgrounds who may have disabilities. But today, this is the first morning of a 4-part online training series, which will be discussing a few different topics that will include community engagement, the NDIS, the My Aged Care system, mental health and self-care, as well as self-advocacy. But today we will be talking about community engagement and the NDIS. Tomorrow we will have a different person, Hayisa. She'll be discussing mental health and self-care. Thursday we will have Dolly talking about the My Aged Care system. And then lastly on Friday, we will have Leon talking about self-advocacy. So you'll have somebody different every morning just to keep it interesting, and a different person who you'll have their different opinions and views on the topic. So that'll keep it nice and interesting. I just wanted to thank NDIA who are funding us to be able to give this to you all. They're funding us through the ILC project, so thanks to them. Okay, just before we actually start discussing our first topic, I just wanted to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm speaking from today. And I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, as well as acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders listening today. So, Hiba, I just told Farah before that if you're wanting to, you can ask me any questions. You can just unmute yourself and you can ask a question and I should be able to hear. So we can have a bit of a discussion whilst I am talking this morning and whilst I'm talking about these topics. If you would prefer, you can also type a question into the chat bar. If you just hover your mouse over the screen, there will be a little logo down the bottom that says chat, and if you click on that, then you can type away your question. And at the end of my topic, I might go through those questions that you've written, if you have written any, and then we can discuss them if you like. So you can either unmute yourself and ask me when we're sort of talking about that one specific issue, or you can always, I can go over them at the end if you're wanting to write down the questions. So it's up to you guys how you would prefer it. But it's basically got to be a bit of a discussion, quite interactive, hopefully. We'll see how we go with the system, and hopefully it works for us well. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint for us. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint here. The title says Community Engagement - Outline. So just let me know if you can't see them, and I'll hopefully can fix the system. But hopefully you can see it. Just let me know if you can't. Okay? Alrighty. So we'll start with the first topic, which is community engagement. So what we'll talk about in regards to community engagement is what our definition that we have, that we tend to use for community engagement. We'll talk about the community engagement spectrum that we have. We'll talk about the different purposes and why we actually use community engagement. And then next we'll talk about how to maybe better engage with different communities in particular. So the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, as well as people with disability. Those two communities in particular we'll talk about. Then we will move on to different challenges of community engagement and some of those things that we tend to, maybe some barriers to properly engaging in community engagement. And then lastly, we'll talk about a case study that I've been a part of here at ADEC, and then show you a short video. So actually I should say that for those, I think there's one person that's just jumped in. So I'll be talking about 2 topics this morning. The first one is community engagement and the second one is NDIS. But there will be a short break in between the 2 topics, so you can get up, move around, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do in that time. Okay, so on the screen here, I have 3 different definitions of community engagement. And we use the term community engagement it's quite a broad idea really, and we can use a few other terms to describe that same thing. Sometimes you might hear the words consultation, participation, collaboration, empowerment. Any of those types of words can be used for the same purpose of community engagement. Okay, so we have 3 definitions up here on the screen. The first is a process that aims to work with customers, stakeholders, or communities to shape decisions and actions in relation to a problem, opportunity, or outcome. The second is a strategy which seeks out a community's values, concerns, and aspirations, which are then incorporated into the decision-making process, and a partnership is established to ensure the community's priorities shape services and systems. And the last one we have up here is people working collaboratively through inspired action and learning to create and realise bold visions for the common future. So I'm just going to ask you all a question. Does anybody pick out certain similarities between these 3 definitions that we have of the one thing of community engagement? Can anybody pick out sort of similarities or common themes in between them all? It's okay if you can't, or if you're having trouble with audio, that's fine. But there are a few different similarities that we can pick out, actually.
Sorry, it is basically working together from different aspects.
Yeah, exactly. Many different,
yeah, that's the common thing in every definition, I think.
Exactly. There are many different organisations have different definitions for the same type of thing. They basically just word it in a few different ways. But yeah, exactly as you said, it's a bit of a process. It's not exactly one aspect or one moment. Hopefully it's an ongoing process, what community engagement is. It can involve a range of views from the community, hopefully from different demographics within the one community. And, sorry, it's collaboration with that community, hopefully to actually build a partnership and a link. Okay, now we'll move on to this spectrum of public participation. Public participation is another word for community engagement. So this spectrum is created by the International Association for Public Participation, and they have broken sort of community engagement into 5 levels. So the lowest that we have here is inform, that moves up to consult, to involve, collaborate, and then empower, which is at the top there. So we'll start by talking about the first here, to inform. So this is the lowest level of community engagement that an organisation might attempt. This is really when the organisation or the service would just be giving objective information to the community. It's really only one way. It's not really a relationship where there's a 2-way dialogue or anything like that. So there's no feedback coming from the community. It's very minimal. It's just really the service is reaching out to that community to give them information. An example of that could be maybe a local council is just giving information to their local residents about a certain topic. They wouldn't actually be expecting any feedback from them. It's just they're giving information to them. So as you can see, there's only one-way dialogue. It's not a very in-depth or high-level type of community engagement, because you're not getting sort of ideas and opinions and thoughts from the community. The next level up we have is to consult. So in this way, there is actually a bit more of a dialogue occurring with the community. So this is when on a certain topic or issue, we can use the council example again, where the council might be asking the community about a certain topic, and then the community would actually respond with feedback about their opinions and ideas on that certain topic at hand or issue that they're facing. So there's 2-way communication, and there's a bit more of a relationship between the two, they're not necessarily separated as much as they are in the first. level. Then we have the third level, which is to involve. So this takes consult to one step forward, meaning that there wouldn't just be one moment of feedback, one exchange, that would be happening regularly over a long period of time. It would be much more of a process. So it's more of an ongoing to and fro between the two groups of people, or the council and the community, if we were to use that one once again. So there would be consistent feedback coming from that community. The next level up we have is to collaborate. Now this is when there would be a much closer partnership with the community and the service, and there's much more equality within that relationship. One doesn't necessarily have power over the other. There's a much better partnership and link, and that's really strengthened when there's the collaborate level. So this would happen when the community is actually part of making some or having a voice in key decisions. So this would maybe identifying what they want to talk about, what the issue they want to be discussed, or it could also be identifying certain solutions that they have thought of in regards to a certain issue. Taking it one step further to empower, that's when the community would actually have the decision-making power in regards to the issue at hand. So there's only one slight difference between collaborate and empower. That's when the community really holds the power in the relationship. It's not equal anymore. The community actually has that say and that power. So if we look back at all the 5 levels, inform, consult, and involve, with those lower levels, the service or the organisation who's wanting to engage the community, they really have the power in this relationship. Whereas when it comes to collaborate, that's when it's much more equal between the two parties. And then when we get to empower, that's when the community would really have that power. So that's what all organisations engaging in community participation should be aiming for, is that higher level of empowerment. Okay, does anybody have any questions over the past few slides that we've addressed? Oh, sorry, I'll go back. No, that's okay. We'll keep on moving forward then. So now we'll talk about a few of those reasons why we actually use community engagement and the purposes of community engagement. So really, depending on what your aim is and what your project is, you may have different purposes, but we can pull out a few broad ones that a lot of organisations using community engagement should really think about. So community engagement can be used to effectively respond to current and relevant challenges happening at that point. So because you are interacting and engaging with the community who would be using that service or the project or whatever system that you're wanting to discuss, they can give you insights into how they use that system. Maybe those daily challenges that they might have trying to use that system or organisation or product or whatever you're wanting information about. Because you can only really get a detailed insight into that system if you're talking to the people who are actually using it. If you've never used the system, it's very difficult to try to figure out maybe where the barriers and where those issues may lie. But once you start talking to people who actually use them on a daily basis, that's when you can get key, really important information about it that you can use then moving forward to maybe better that system. Okay. Next is that community engagement can sometimes lead to an increase of social capital, or even building some communities' capacity to be independent. So it's not just maybe about that issue anymore. It can become much more holistic and have a lot of great impacts for that community, because maybe by engaging the community in this certain organisation, or maybe could it be local council or state government or whoever it is, by increasing those lines of communication, that relationship, that tie, that link can be strengthened, and then that can be a source of maybe support for that community. And if they have, the more support a community or a person has, that the greater they are able to deal with certain issues and things that may crop up. Another side of that, as communities may be involved in more systems, organisations, services, they can gain a bit more information and knowledge about how these systems work, sort of the nuances within them and the different aspects of them, but also different opportunities that may exist that the person or the communities could take up if they wanted to. So with this increased knowledge, they have a greater awareness of what's out there and how they can support themselves, really, and become a bit more independent rather than maybe as reliant on certain people or certain other organisations and services. Another purpose or aim of community engagement is to actually improve that service or system that that organisation is offering. So as I mentioned too before, it's only really by engaging with those people who are using that system that they can gather enough really important and useful information as to how to properly maybe fix those gaps, which maybe looking at it objectively don't seem to exist. But when you look at it realistically in the real world, when you're talking about people, that's when those certain issues or barriers and things may exist. So you need to be talking to those people who encounter that to be able to then improve those problems and gaps in your system. Okay, and then the next we have is can actually increase the community's access to services and institutions in general. Because when the community becomes aware of more systems and services, they're aware of who else is out there that can support them or where they can find more information to be a better self-advocate maybe for themselves or their family or for even their wider community. It's when you start being involved in more of these discussions that you can learn really a lot of information and be pointed in the right direction to find the right amount of support that you might be needing or your family might be needing. And when you have that greater awareness, you would more likely be able to access those type of, or the correct support for you, the correct services for you. And through community engagement, greater trust can be built. Well, the community can have greater trust in certain services and organisations and systems. It's only really when trust exists that communities and clients and people would be more likely to actually invest in those types of organisations, because they have an awareness as to how the system works, how the organisation works, and they trust that the organisation would be working in the best way to benefit those people who are involved. So when you involve them, they can actually have a greater understanding and that trust can build, which is really important. And when there's trust, people are more likely to use it. Okay. Any questions about that at all?
No.
No. Okay, good. I might just give you a quick example. For those of you...
There is something. In addition to all these things, can we say that it adds to the lifestyle as well?
Exactly. It can have a very, it can have a very broad improvement sort of factor to a person's life when they start engaging in these processes. So it's almost like a two-way benefit. Maybe the system or the organisation can benefit from the information the community has to offer, but the community can also benefit from learning more about the organisation and the system and those types of services. So that's great if both people can really, or both parties can really benefit from it.
Yeah, so through using different resources, they feel that their lifestyle has changed and they're able to do something.
Exactly, you're right there. I'll give you an example. For those who are aware of the NDIS and have a bit of knowledge about the NDIS, you could probably see that there are good aspects of the NDIS and it is helping many people. But sadly, there are also some people which it is letting down and they're falling in between the gaps and the system isn't properly able to support them. Now, the NDIS was becoming more aware that this is happening, specifically for people from maybe non-English speaking backgrounds. So last year, yes, it was 2019, when they started reaching out to more communities, organisations that were working with these communities to gather a better insight as to how maybe the NDIS wasn't working for them. I know last year the NDIS, with the state government, approached ADEC, because we work with non-English speaking communities, to be able to gather a group of people so that they could properly express to the people who were making those types of decisions and who have an impact as to how to shape the structure. They were able to tell them what maybe they had had difficulties with, and where they needed the system to support them better. So that's just an example of how maybe a government organisation has tried to engage with a community by using maybe another organisation as a facilitator. That's how we functioned at that point. ADEC was more of a facilitator for that discussion. Okay. So now we'll talk a bit more about how to maybe better engage with cold communities, because it's hugely important that we reach out to our non-English speaking communities, as Victoria is a hugely multicultural state. Just about half of us in the state are either born overseas or one of our parents were in fact born overseas. So it's imperative really that we make it accessible for these types of communities to be able to engage, so that they can have their say and that the system and services can be better suited to them. Okay, so one technique to make engagement a bit easier for cold communities is to make the process and inquiries accessible for people, for the entire community. So to do this, you might offer resources in their community language or in plain English, whatever they would prefer, to give them that option. To have interpreters present if you're wanting to talk to them over the phone or in person, or maybe have a discussion session. To have interpreters there who are briefed on the topic so that they can actually use the correct language, so you know that there is no misinterpretation at all. And maybe when you're getting the word out there about the project and about wanting to hear back from the community, you have to think about maybe what sort of medias you're going to engage with. So maybe using ethnic newspapers, radios, even using the computer type of online forums, but being aware that some communities may have sufficient computer literacy, but some may not. It is quite dependent on the community you're wanting to engage with specifically. So it's important to have an awareness of that specific community, not just broadly thinking of cold communities full stop, because you can't necessarily compare one non-English speaking community to another. They're all very different, as we all know. And this moves us on to the next point, where we need to see that diversity amongst the community, amongst our cold communities. For example, there may be two sort of Asian cultures, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can take information from one and then use it to make a system for the other. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you make something for one community, it's going to be useful for another. You really need to talk to that community who you're making the system for, so that it is appropriate for them, really. And we can take that one step further by saying that within the community, there's also diversity. There's people from all different backgrounds. There's people of different ages, men, women. You need to talk to people who have disabilities, who may not have disabilities, who have children, who are single, who may be homosexual, who are gender fluid, because you need to gather a holistic view of the community, so you see where that community really lies and where their values, attitudes, opinions are, so that you can create the most appropriate system for them, really.
Please, what's the meaning of cult?
Pardon?
The full meaning of cult.
So that's culturally and linguistically diverse.
Sorry, culturally?
Culturally and linguistically diverse.
Diverse.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So we could either use cold communities or non-English speaking communities. They're the two different terms that I've been using interchangeably there. And now we'll just briefly touch on the term of intersectionality. Now, has anybody seen that term before, have a bit of an understanding of what that term means?
What term?
The intersectionality, this one here. No, that's okay. It's a term that we use.
I think I know intersection is when something comes together.
Mm-hmm.
But intersectionality, I don't know when you put the intersectionality, but I know intersection is like when something is between and they come together, like intersection.
Mm-hmm. You're on the right path there, definitely. So intersectionality has to do with a person's identity. And what we mean by that is there may be different sides of a person's identity which comes together in them. So you can maybe think of an intersection where there's different roads coming to one point, but for a person, there's different sides of them coming to form their identity. And this is with all of us. We all maybe have different parts of our identity that come to the forefront in different environments and different contexts, depending on what we're in. At work, we're a certain person. At home, we're a certain person. When we're out doing one of our hobbies, we're a certain type of person, but that's still us. So what we mean by sort of that there's those different sides within our identity is that some people may experience things differently because of those different sides of their identity. For example, there could be a man from Indonesia who is Muslim and homosexual. He would experience things very differently from an elderly married woman from Indonesia who maybe is Christian. So those key different aspects of their identity, maybe they would experience their life differently because of those sides of them. And maybe they could even experience discrimination because of those different sides of them. So it's just basically understanding that within one person, there's different sides to them, and then they may experience certain things because of those different sides. Yes, these two people may be Indonesian, but because of these certain aspects of them, they may find barriers or discrimination because of that. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So next we'll move on to the next dot point, which is co-design. So if the community is closely involved in sort of the creation of the process and of the method of community engagement, it means that the process will be appropriate to the community and that it's likely the community would be able to sort of give much more information and invest more into the project if the whole process suits them better, really. It just makes sense. So if you involve the community from the very start to get their opinion as to how the process and project can work best for them, it's much more likely that the community would be engaged in it. The next point we have there is the aim to build capacity. As we alluded to a few slides before, both parties can actually benefit from community engagement. It's not just the service and the organisation that can gather a lot of really useful information to be able to better their services and products that they're making, but the community, in fact, can gather a lot from that interaction also. They can gather a lot of information and skills from this type of interaction, which can then build their individual capacity to be able to sort of better engage in the wider society. So we really have to think about that, especially as some communities who may be newer to Australia may find that they have a lot of barriers in their life. Maybe if they've come from a very different life and Australia is a huge shock to them and it's all very different, that should be really something that's quite important. And if we can build a few skills for them, that would make a huge impact in the long-term quality of their life, really. And they would be much more empowered, which is that top tier of community engagement. If we go back to the, here we go, if we go back to the spectrum, empowerment is the top level. So if we can give back to the community and they can actually build skills we're reaching the top level of community engagement, which is what we should always be aiming for. We shouldn't be aiming for the lower levels. We should be aiming for those top levels, because it's with those top levels that we can really create the best system, best structure, and both parties benefit. And lastly, we should really always try to develop trust with the communities that we are engaging with, and to build their confidence in the systems and in the organisations. As I said before, it's only with trust and confidence that the community would actually give back and give enough information and valid information that the organisation is needing. Understandably, if you don't trust the people you're talking to, you're not really going to tell them much and tell them much personal information. So you really need to make clear expectations, have open communication with the organisation, so that they feel much more maybe personally invested in the project and would be much more likely to continue and giving their feedback. So there can be a sustained relationship between the two parties.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we'll talk about bettering engagement with people with disabilities. About 20% of the Australian population has a disability of some sort, and for a long, long time, people with disabilities were not involved in discussions, even in about services and supports that are relevant to them. They were completely ignored, and their opinions and thoughts were not valued. And then it's created a world around them which a lot of the time doesn't suit them, it doesn't suit their needs. So it's really important, as they're 20% of the population, that we do talk to them, we do engage them in conversation and find out how certain things can work better for them. Because realistically, it's just a bit unfair if you're not involving people with disabilities, because they are an important and decent percentage of the Australian population. So a few techniques to better engage with people with disabilities is to keep in mind that, similar to COLD communities, disability is also very diverse. People may have just one disability, but they may also have multiple disabilities. Two people may have autism, but it may appear very differently in them, depending on their ages and what their hobbies are, what they want to be able to do with their life. The disability may impact them in different ways. So we have to keep that in mind. The disability can be very diverse, even if people have the same disability. And the disability is a very individual and personal topic, really, because it's part of them. So we really have to keep that in mind when talking with people with disabilities.
I'm sorry, can you talk about that again?
So
like you're trying to.
So disability is hugely diverse. Similarly with COLD communities, there's a huge level of diversity with disabilities. There may be people who have a physical disability, intellectual disability, emotional, social, psychiatric disability. So it can affect people in different parts of their lives, but also there could be two people who have the same disability. So two people may both have autism, but it could appear very differently in these two people. One person may have difficulties communicating and speaking verbally. Maybe the other person has difficulty socializing with people or doing certain tasks. So with one person, it might be a bit more communication that they have difficulties with. The other person, it could be more social. That's just one example. And that's across the board in all of the disabilities that we have in our world. It's almost a range. Some people it may appear in one way, but with another person it may appear in a different way. So we just have to keep that in mind.
Sorry, I think one more thing makes it different. Maybe there are two people who have the same disability and maybe the same gender and whatever, but maybe one of them is more confident, so the level of confidence is different. Mm-hmm. So he responds to the situation in this different way.
Exactly, and that's jumping down to intersectionality once again. Different aspects of the person would definitely adjust as to how that person deals with their disability, if they have the confidence, if they have certain skills, if they are from a certain background. That may alter how they perceive themselves and how they perceive their disability, and we have to really keep that in mind. So that, yeah, that's a really great point that you've made. Next, we'll move on to the really important point, is to make sure it's accessible in all ways, which can be sometimes difficult because disability is very broad and very diverse and people have all different needs. But we really do have to try our best to make sure it's as accessible for everyone as we can, really. So in that way, co-design and early planning is key, so we can find out what those needs for the people who are wanting to be engaged in are, so we can make sure we allow for those certain needs. So physically, we could incorporate ramps, making sure doorways are wide enough. Maybe there's sensory spaces for people if that's necessary. In terms of communication, if there's an Auslan interpreter that's needed, if there's certain assistive technologies, maybe hearing augmentation or hearing loops, speech to text, anything like that, having captions if you're using visuals, making sure you keep that in mind. And then there's the other side of it. Maybe somebody could have an intellectual disability and they may need to have discussions in a certain way so that they can properly understand. So thinking about using easy English and maybe even having support people there if the person with the disability would feel much more comfortable having maybe their carer, parent or support worker there to support them in engaging in this discussion. Because really, if somebody isn't feeling comfortable, both the organisation and the person isn't really going to get much out of it. So if you can make that environment really casual, really comfortable, then both parties will get a lot from it. Another point to remember is that you may need to allow for extra time when interacting with people with disabilities and engaging them, just for logistics, and also allowing them to sort of properly express themselves and get their ideas out there without feeling rushed and intimidated, like they can't properly explain how they're feeling or why they're feeling or why they've gone through certain things. So just time can really be a huge help for people with disabilities. One other aspect to really keep in mind is your language about disability. For a long time, people have sort of used certain language which puts the disability before the person, rather than seeing the person first for who they are. So an example of this is people sometimes use disabled person, autistic person, rather than saying person with disability or person with autism. Can we see the difference between those two? How it would be a bit better to phrase things such as person with disability rather than disabled person, because it makes the person come to the forefront rather than their disability being seen first.
Yes.
Yeah. And we've already sort of touched on intersectionality there, how it's sort of important to just keep in mind that there may be other aspects to the person which may make things a bit more difficult if they have the confidence, maybe if they don't have confidence, maybe having their support person there so they are more willing to sort of engage in discussions, or if there's certain other sides of their identity such as their background or religion, so that they may view their disability in a certain way and view themselves in a certain way. So just keeping all of those things in mind can create a better environment for people with disabilities so they can engage more so in giving more feedback and in these types of organisations and systems and services. Any questions about that?
No, all good.
Okay, good. So now we'll move on to a few challenges and risks and difficulties that we may come across when attempting to engage with certain communities or just communities in general. one key issue that organisations may come across is getting enough community representation and getting the broad and accurate view from the community. There's always the risk that the community may not respond if you reach out to them, but that may in fact just reflect back on potentially the issue that you're asking them about is not an issue, or it's not relevant to them. So that may just mean you could potentially reflect on the topic that you're asking them and see if it's actually relevant to the community at all. And there's also the risk that only certain people in the community may involve themselves, not necessarily all key demographics of the community, such as maybe young mothers or people who are working or the elderly. We need to be able to get opinions and people from all of those key areas, because it's really important that we can get those views and opinions so that we can get more of a holistic view of where that community sits at that point. And yeah, that sort of leads on to the second point of establishing a holistic community view, because that's really important. Otherwise, we might be missing some really key information that could be hugely important in bettering the systems for the communities, so it's more likely to be used. Another thing that organisations may encounter is community engagement fatigue. Now, potentially if it's a long-term project or a long-term process, the community involved may just get a little bit tired and fatigued of being involved, which is understandable. To combat this, it can be important to remain honest and open with the community so that they're fully aware of sort of what the expectations are, that this will be more of a long-term thing, but these will be the outcomes. So hopefully you'll be able to show them that this is what the process will be, but these are what the potential outcomes could be to make it worth being involved for this amount of time. And also there's the possibility that of disillusionment, meaning the community may think that A, B, C, D could be outcomes, but in fact they won't be able to be achieved from this project or process. So that's another reason why there needs to be open communication and honesty between the two parties, so that they can see really what the aims of the project will be, and so that there won't be any disappointment if the things that they expected were to be achieved aren't, because that is possible if the community really isn't part of the entire process, and if there isn't that equal partnership between the two parties and information is withheld from the community. Disillusionment can happen and does happen, in fact. Okay. So now we'll just talk about a case study that we had at ADEC. So as part of the ILC project, which we were doing last year, we went around to 8 different communities around Melbourne. So we spoke to the Turkish, Arabic, Vietnamese, Japanese, Afghani, Karen, Burmese and Chinese groups. And we spoke to people with disabilities, their carers and wider community. Firstly, just in a consultation to get their opinions, to get their attitudes, to get their views on certain topics, and what they felt like they wanted to know more about. So they were sort of leading the discussion, and we could see where potentially we could assist them in that. And also we wanted to find out in those areas that they wanted to know more information on, where their current knowledge level sat, and maybe if there are any pre-existing stigmas that existed for their particular community. So we had consultations with all of those 8 communities so that we could really try to tailor the service we were giving them, therefore making it much more appropriate and that the community would more likely engage. So what we decided on once consulting with the 8 communities is that we would do a 3-part series, information workshops about equality in society in the workplace, family violence and creating respectful relationships, as well as LGBTIQ+ tolerance. So in all of these 3 topics, there was a mixture of different levels of knowledge and values, attitudes, and stigmas amongst the 8 communities. So what we had to do is really tailor those sessions specifically to the communities so that it was much more appropriate and so that the community got more out of it, really. So after the consultations, we had the sessions, and there was consistent feedback that we took from the communities. After the end of every of the sessions, we would take feedback so we could see potentially where improvements could be made, and if there was something in particular they wanted to know more about, which we could address in the next session. And another aspect that we really wanted to include was giving the communities a lot of sort of resources and contact numbers and phone numbers and organisations they knew that could assist them if they needed to. So to do this, we basically created a resource pack, which included a contact page, really, of key organisations that could assist in these 3 areas, and the phone numbers and interpreters and translators they could contact if necessary. So in this way, we were giving the information straight to the communities, and then they were empowered from all the knowledge and skills that we were giving them over the 3 sessions, so that they felt empowered to be able to address any of these. If any issues cropped up in these areas, they would then feel empowered to be able to deal with them in a way they saw fit. And maybe independently, they would be able to advocate for themselves, rather than having to maybe contact an advocate at ADEC to be able to assist them with it. They would know who they could contact in a certain issue so that they could get the correct help for them. So that's how we dealt with it in this project. So we had consultations, we had continuous feedback, and we gave a lot of tools, empowering skills, empowering resource kit, so that the groups that we spoke to could feel much more independent in their learning and independent in when going back out into the community and being able to deal with issues themselves. So that's just how we've done it with one of our projects, but depending obviously on the project and what you're looking at, there can be different approaches. Any questions about, so that brings us to the end of the community engagement module. Do you have any questions at all about the case study or about anything that we've spoken about before?
No.
No, thank you.
I don't have.
Alexa, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, go for it.
I just wanted to ask, with this project that you did you find like a trend or in the way that people categorize or what they view as disability? And because I think it affects how a lot of people in our communities sort of even what they consider to be disability, and that affects how they seek help or advice or any resources that they
yeah, you're completely right there that COLD communities and non-English speaking communities, well, as all communities do, they have certain opinions on disability in particular, and their approach to disability can be varied amongst the different communities. So some communities may see disability as the fault of the mother, potentially. Some communities see that it's a curse brought on the family to have a disability, and it really can be quite a varied attitude towards disability. But some communities also see it as quite a private matter, that they don't necessarily want to get services and supports in the home because the family wants to be able to care for the person with the disability, which they're completely entitled to do. And the NDIS is quite reasonable in that manner. If they see that the family wants to give their care to the person with the disability, they'll allow that, and they won't push certain things on the community, on the family. But it is a very varied opinion based on disability, depending on the community, because sadly a lot of communities see it as a negative, and there's something wrong with the person, they're not normal. But really that idea should be challenged, because just imagine if you were the person with the disability and people were saying those types of things to you, it would be hugely detrimental to people's mental health, and people may lose all confidence to be able to do things for themselves and to even want to go out into the community, because they may be scared that people will look at them in a funny way, or they may do things to them just because they have a disability. So yes, communities do have different opinions on disability, but it's always worth discussing them, because it's only with discussions that sort of these ideas can be properly broken down, so that you can understand, well, why do I think like this? Why does my family think like this? Why does my community have this type of opinion on people with disabilities? So although it may be a very slow thing to change, it's always worth discussing it, and any little sort of improvement in this way of thinking is always good.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, so now, since that's the end of the community engagement session, we'll have a brief break, about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and have the NDIS session. So if it's 11:28, we'll come back at 11:33. Okay.
Okay. So do we leave?
So you can don't
everything?
exit the session. You can just mute yourself and maybe close the camera if you want, and then come back in about 5 minutes, and we'll begin things again.
Okay.